I'm trapped in the public library and things have gone from strange to horrifying. I love reading. I love books, words, and literature in most forms. If it can occupy the deafening drone inside my mind, then I'm ready to glue my eyes to the pages. That's why I spend so much time at the public library. The library isn't that big, it's just about what you'd expect to see in a town like Ridgewood. When you walk in, there is a children's section to the right, the adult section straight ahead, and various study rooms to the left. The librarians have a break room, and I'm certain there's a sort of back room where literature deemed inappropriate or perhaps even controversial is kept. After an exhausting day of yard work, I decided to spend the rest of my evening perusing the well-stocked shelves of the library. Upon entering, there were a few other people presumably partaking in the interest of knowledge through words on paper. A group of students seemed to be studying at one of the circular tables. A young woman was sitting by herself near a window. A couple were meandering between the aisles, being a bit too loud, and there were a plethora of lone individuals like myself. The library didn't stay open incredibly late. It usually closed around 9 p.m. and it was roughly 7 p.m. when I arrived. I'm what you might call a regular, so the librarian greeted me by name. "Good evening, Damien." She was a sweet elderly woman with glasses, short light gray hair, and a soothing voice. I smiled in her direction. "Hello, Mrs. James. I hope you've had yourself a pleasant day." "It's been just fine, Damien, thank you. What brings you in tonight? Looking for anything in particular?" she asked warmly. "No, ma'am. I thought I'd take a look around and see what pops out at me." "Oh. Well, I do hope you find something truly captivating." Mrs. James has a certain inflection in her dialect that always reminded me of a Southern belle. Maybe she was one when she was younger. "You'll be the first to know, Mrs. James. Now, if you don't mind." I trailed off as I smiled again and walked away from the front reception. Mrs. James's debutante demeanor flowed through the air behind me. "Take care and try not to get lost." I wondered how I could ever get lost in a place like this. She was probably just teasing me because, as I mentioned before, the library is relatively small. I avoided the children's section and went straight to the back. It just so happened that the couple was there as well, and now they had resorted to using the obscurity of the shelves as a PDA concealer. However, they did stop when they noticed I was nearby. At first glance, nothing was catching my eye. I ran my fingers along the bindings and scoured the titles diligently. There were books on physics, hydroponics, botany, medieval war strategy, architecture, and even spatial discovery. Obviously, I was in the nonfiction section, but I'll read fiction too. It just depends on what piques my interest. And there it was, the book I'd read that night. The one book that outshined all others, a biography of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, I know what you're thinking. What the hell? Really? That's the book you chose? While I might be inclined to agree with you, something I failed to mention was that I'm a history buff, and Leonardo was the subject of most, if not all, of my character studies when I was in school. But I wasn't planning on checking the book out. I simply wanted to do a bit of quiet reading to help calm the incessant mental storm in my mind. As I emerged from the back of the library, I noticed that most of the patrons had gone. The young woman was still sitting by the window, and a few of the lone individuals were wandering, but other than that, it was me, them, and Mrs. James. The elderly librarian smiled at me when I flashed the book cover at her, and I found a table to sit at. I opened the book and delved deep into the pages. I hadn't read this particular book, so I was curious about what discrepancies it may have versus the knowledge I already had of Leo's life. For some reason, it had all sorts of new information. There were things that a part of me wondered if historians even knew. I found myself completely enthralled with each letter as if it were a story all on its own. You know what they say? Time flies when you're having fun. I soon realized I had forgotten to pay attention to what time it was, and as I forcibly averted my eyes from the book, I noticed it was past closing. Why hadn't Mrs. James said anything? Everyone else had gone, and it seemed to be just me, myself, and the horrendous droning of ambient library noise, which is essentially the absence of all noise, but sometimes silence is deafening. Before panicking, I checked around. I thought that perhaps Mrs. James had a mental lapse, and if I left without anyone noticing, then there wouldn't be any problems. My only issue, though, was that the entrance was gone. I don't mean like the door was missing or anything like that. The reality was that a solid wall stood where the front door used to be, as if it had never been there. I've been in this library more times than I can count, so there was no way I could have somehow made a mistake. The realization of the door was only exacerbated by the fact that I suddenly noticed all of the windows were gone as well. There was nothing but a solid wall in every spot that once had a view of the outside world. I thought I might have fallen asleep and promptly pinched myself. The pain that shot through my arm confirmed I hadn't, unless I could suddenly feel pain while dreaming. So there I was, standing in the middle of the public library with not one soul to be seen. Maybe it was a prank. A sort of trick the bookworm kind of thing. I tried to force myself against the solid wall that replaced the entrance in case it wasn't real, but that only caused an uncomfortable throbbing ache in my shoulder. The wall was harder than I imagined and certainly not fake. I was trapped. This is where my instincts kicked in, and I broke the golden rule of library etiquette by shouting, "Hello? Is anyone here?" I waited for a response, but none came. The only sound was the faint clicking of what I presumed was an air conditioner. I started to wander and kept inquiring into the open air. Where is everyone? This isn't funny. Hello? Is anyone in here? If the sound of my voice could equal another person, then I'd no longer be alone, but unfortunately, that's not how the world works. Then again, how could I ever deign to speak on the inner mechanisms of the universe and the world when I'm stuck in the public library? How could I have not noticed things changing around me? Was that book so captivating that it prevented me from witnessing the alteration of time and space? A cold shudder flashed through my veins as every synapse in my brain exploded like fireworks on the 4th of July. Too many thoughts flooded my mind all at once, like, what will I eat? Do the bathrooms still function? Where will I sleep? And many more. I continued to let my mind seize control over my critical thinking skills, and not in a good way. Luckily, I meandered past a drinking fountain and just so happened to tap it upon impulse, revealing a water spout. The water looked clean, and I subsequently tasted it, and much to my satisfaction, it didn't taste bad. So the water dilemma was solved, but that still left the second most important issue: food. I could do without a comfortable place to sleep. Hell, I wasn't short on reading material to help me fall asleep, but none of that would matter if I starved to death. It was then that I realized something astounding, and it was another moment of undeniable confusion. The library had doubled, perhaps even tripled in size. Now several new branching wings were entirely unfamiliar, and the original layout had been warped to accommodate the new additions. I did call out for help again, but the result was the same, and in terms of definition, that meant I was insane. Could you blame me, though? Naturally, I'd want to be saved, or did I? Books and writing and words were my passion, and now I was surrounded by a veritable treasure trove of untouched pages with no one to bother me. Maybe this was a good thing? Something about this place twisted my mind, It made me disregard my primal survivalist priorities for a sense of hobbyist comfort. But I was blessed with a good head on my shoulders, and although things did not seem in my favor, I was still standing strong. However, one of the newly emerged wings was almost calling me. I felt an overwhelming urge to explore it, as if the equivalent of the fountain of youth lay somewhere along its shelved corridor. And before I knew it, I was putting one foot in front of the other right towards that wing. It had to have appeared for a reason, and it was so oddly placed. It extended diagonally from the middle of the back wall, where I originally found the biography, and took a sharp left turn a ways down. As I stepped into it, I heard a faint but familiar noise. The sound of an office chair creaking as weight compressed it. There was only one place I knew of that had a chair, and that was behind the front desk. Then, I heard the sound of the wheels under the chair rolling against the short carpet. I was not alone. I crept slowly between the now towering bookshelves to get close enough to see the desk. It seemed further away than it should have been, but as it came into view, I felt warmth, comfort, and salvation. It was Mrs. James. Well, she was facing away from me, but her short hairstyle was unmistakable even from the back. I approached her quickly and rested my palms flat on the desk. "Mrs. James, you have no idea how glad I am to see you." There wasn't so much as a twitch from her. She said nothing, did nothing, and for all intents and purposes, she seemed frozen, although I couldn't see her face. "Ma'am?" I asked softly, and still no reaction. It was then that I broke another rule of library etiquette. I walked behind the front desk. I must have missed her movements because Mrs. James was facing away from me again. Now she appeared to be looking out into the library. Was she ignoring me? Then I thought, maybe I'm dead. But that wouldn't explain the other phenomena. "Mrs. James, are you okay?" I inquired further, and she still said nothing. She didn't even seem to be breathing if I stared hard enough. I took the initiative and gripped the back of her chair, spinning her around in one swift motion. It shouldn't have been possible. Somehow, she was still facing away from me. I spun the chair and saw nothing but the back of her head. But then, I realized that was her head. Her entire head was a copy of what it looked like if you were walking behind her. I stepped back and found myself at a loss for words. What could you say anyway? There I was, standing mere inches away from an entity that carried a certain sense of familiarity but was aberrant on all accounts. I felt even more alone and even more terrified with the knowledge that this twisted version of Mrs. James would now be free to fuel my nightmares while I was trapped here. I continued to create distance between me and... I slipped inside the office area where the employee break room was. While one horrifying manifestation sat just outside the room, a triumphant discovery awaited me within. Vending machines of all kinds lined the walls. Trail mix, candy bars, protein bars, chips, drinks, and even a machine for an assortment of random things like medicine and earplugs. I had no idea this many vending machines would be necessary for a small public library, but if recent events were anything to go by, then this current library was anything but ordinary. That meant that these machines were likely another aspect of this unorthodox version of Ridgewood Library. Still, my food dilemma was resolved. Well, as long as I could find a way to get the items without paying. I wasn't hungry at that moment, so I reluctantly left the room only to find Mrs. James had disappeared. Standing still, I looked across the now absolutely massive and ever-expanding library for any sign of her, but there was none. Now it seemed the library had quadrupled in size, and I noticed something else too. Someone or something had been moving and stacking books. Mrs. James, perhaps? It's hard to say. I hadn't witnessed her move, and I was completely unsure of her motives or intentions towards me. For all I know, whatever she asked could be the whole reason why I'm trapped here, or it could be something else entirely. With the knowledge that a fear-inducing version of the former librarian was wandering somewhere in the library, I chose my steps carefully. I found another new section that had comically large encyclopedias all about seafaring vessels and the lore of Star Trek. Strange, I know, but the books were big enough that they gave me an idea. I would build a book shelter to at least feel somewhat protected from whatever may be lurking amidst the pages. It didn't take me long, but man, were those books heavy. I took a glance at one, but despite the title on the covers, the contents within were written in a garbled language I couldn't recognize. So, I stacked them. I made high book walls in a straight corner and found even larger ones to use as the roof. It was about as comfy can get with a house of books. To add the finishing touches, I went to the children's section of the library, which luckily remained the same despite so many other aspects changing. Once there, I snagged several cushions off the chairs people would sit in to read comfortably. After I laid them down in my book fort, it felt complete and I felt safe. But safe, I was not. The entire time I was constructing my peculiar literature-based hovel, I had that uneasy feeling of someone being in the room. Like I was being watched. I covered my fort entrance with the large book I decided to use as a door and tried to sleep. Although I was quite comfortable, I just couldn't shake that feeling. So I left my shelter and headed back to the vending machines. It was about time I ate something anyway, and I had no idea what time it was since there were no clocks. Fortunately, Mrs. James wasn't sitting in her chair behind the front desk, so I slipped into the lounge uninterrupted. When I studied the machines, I noticed they didn't have any defined slot for money. Upon learning that, I typed the code for a small pack of trail mix, which was D6, and the machine promptly dispensed it. I did the same thing with one of the drink machines and received vitamin water. I sat in the lounge and enjoyed my quiet meal, if you could call it that, while remaining vigilant for anything going on outside of the room. Luckily, I was undisturbed, and although the food was measly, I still felt satisfied. At least the drink was nice. After I finished, I walked out of the room and stood behind the front desk. I gazed out into the library, shuddered at the thought of Mrs. James being somewhere I couldn't see. I shifted my eyes to the left, then the right, and then left again. But I did a double take because the young woman, the one from earlier, was sitting by where the window should be. I gasped to myself and froze in place. She didn't seem to notice me or care, for that matter. Her eyes were fixed on whatever book she was reading. I took a breath and mustered the courage to call out to her, "Hello?" She turned a page and continued to read. I came out from behind the desk and approached her. "Miss, can you hear me?" She turned another page, but I noticed something odd. She had this deep red line around her neck as if it had been cut. When I reached her, I tapped her shoulder. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The moment I finished my question, I was suddenly away from her, almost like I had been teleported. I was now the same distance away as I had been before I started to approach her. While I tried to collect myself, the woman began to move. She closed her book, set it down, and then slowly turned her head towards me. There was the sound of tearing skin and popping bones emanating from her entire body, like she was recovering from rigor mortis. She kept turning her head and her body until she was facing away from me. When she had fully turned around, she arched backward like she was about to do a gymnast tumble, except she stayed in that position. Her head hung down and her wrists twisted before she started to crawl towards me. I took a step back and bumped into a bookshelf. She continued to twist her body in impossible angles, and the sound of her bones breaking was tooth-clenching. Just as I was about to run away, her head separated from her shoulders and thumped against the floor. Her body kept crawling despite her lack of cranial direction, and I watched in horror as her head started to roll on its own. The head came straight for me, and I stepped out of its way. There was a maniacal and all too malevolent smile spread wide on its face. The crawling body bled profusely and soaked the short carpet, but it remained steadfast in its pursuit of me. I sprinted away, all the while hearing the sound of the head tumbling across the floor and the quickly distancing echo of the body's bones cracking. I nearly got lost weaving through the ever-changing bookshelves and came around a sharp corner to be met face-to-face with Mrs. James. She was standing in a corner, arms at her sides, and still looking as if she was facing away from me, except the front of her body was towards me. I jumped and gasped, almost having the wind knocked out of me from fear alone. Mrs. James didn't move, and I didn't either until I heard the horrifying sounds of that devilish exorcist-esque terror fast approaching. I ran away again. I ran until I thought the coast was clear, and when I did, I returned to my book shelter. I all but threw myself inside and pulled the large book door over the entryway. I was sealed away from the nightmarish thing lurking between the shelves. I'm writing this all down if I never make it out of here, and I'll be sure to update you soon. Hell, I'm not even sure anyone will ever see this. For now, I'm going to put my phone away because the disembodied head rolls by my shelter every couple of minutes, and it only takes another couple for that decrepit crab-walking body to follow. I hope I'm not discovered. I visited a library with a strange rule and am now trapped here. Hello, I have a warning for anyone wanting to visit a library, as you may be stuck like I am forever. Let me give you some insight so maybe you can avoid my fate. This all started when I wanted to go to a library in my city. You see, the city I live in isn't by any means large, it's more of an average-sized city that is the hub of 3 national highways. Not much goes on here until recently when it was reported that someone went missing at the library. I work for the local newspaper and they wanted me to go down to check what was happening. Since a police report was filed, the only thing they were able to do was to file a missing person report. When I got there, the police were already done, but I wanted to do my digging, so I asked the librarian what happened. Hello, I am a reporter for the local paper, the Ridge Beach Herald. I wanted to know if you had any information you could give the news. I spoke with confidence. The librarian seemed nervous and a bit scared when he spoke. Well, to tell you the truth, not much we can give. When checking the cameras, the young woman came and grabbed a book in the fictional aisle and never left. We don't have enough cameras to cover all the aisles, so we have no clue where she could have gone. But we know she has never left because the cameras would show her leaving. May I see the camera feed so I can make sure? That's if you don't mind, of course, I said while smiling and rubbing my neck. The librarian looked a little worried and wanted to tell me something, but nothing came out. He instead just waved me toward a door behind the desk. Inside the room was one computer and a few filing cabinets. He sat down at the computer and logged into the system. Pulling up the cameras, he then just pointed to the screen and spoke. Well, here she is in stonewashed blue pants and a teal-colored shirt. If you watch, she comes to the fictional aisle and stares at the wall for almost 20 minutes, then shakes her head. She then goes and grabs a book and walks behind this wall. We haven't seen her since. The strangest thing is there's nothing there when you go to where she was. It's just a couch and 2 chairs with a small table and magazines. He looked a bit shaken up when he showed me. She has been gone for almost a whole month. It just makes no sense. I thanked the man and then decided to take a look around the library. I have my tape recorder on and was recording everything I saw that seemed odd. As I got to the fiction section, I saw a wall poster with just a few little rules. Nothing too odd except for one. No excessive talking or loud noises, no food or drinks, no running, report all book damage to the librarian, use bookmarks, place the books back where they belong, never fall asleep while reading. At the time I thought the last one was a little odd, but I could imagine why it exists. I walked around the same wall the missing girl did and saw the couch and chairs as the librarian said. However, there was a book at the table sitting there open without a bookmark. Thinking nothing of it, I walked to the table and laid my backpack down at the foot of the chair I was sitting on. I pulled out my laptop and started to write the story while quietly listening to my recordings. While sitting there and listening, I heard a voice in the background after reading the rules. "Help me, help me, help me." The disembodied voice sent a chill up my spine as it seemed so uncanny, kind of human, but not quite there. I was a little taken aback by this and decided to look around the area I was in. When I got to the poster and looked around, there was nothing there other than a red bookmark with the words "Keep Calm" and "Read On." I picked it up and walked back to my chair. I placed the bookmark on the book that was still open as I wasn't sure who left it there. I kept typing away this story when I felt someone or something was staring at me. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I felt fear. Looking around, I kept seeing nothing. However, I still had this funny feeling that I was in danger and being watched. I closed my laptop and stood up. I kept feeling this dread, so I decided to walk around and maybe look and see if anyone was watching me. I turned the corner and nothing, no one was there. I looked behind the shelves and rows of books and saw nothing. I decided to sit back down and started to write more. After about half an hour, I started to feel drowsy, but I had to get this paper out. So I finally finished it and started to proofread the story. The further I read, the more I drifted off to sleep. I believe I finally passed out because I woke up in panic-induced cold sweats. I looked around and I was still in the same library. I decided to get up and pack my things after submitting my story. Walking downstairs, I noticed something was very off. The lights were much dimmer and there wasn't a single person there. I looked around and it was nothing like the library I was in. There are endless rows of books with tables and chairs scattered throughout. I started to panic and started to run in one direction, eventually ran out of breath and could still not see an end in sight. I kept looking for an exit and started to shout, "Hello? Is anyone there?" It just kept echoing with no response back. So I kept walking in one direction, hoping to come across someone or anything. My hope dwindled as I realized this wasn't a dream and I was here. I was so exhausted and needed to rest. I found a chair and a table that had a lamp on it that was turned on but had no power line. As I sat there, I decided to open my laptop, and it seemed I still had internet somehow, and the battery on my laptop was showing that it was fully charged. This was odd because I never plugged it in today. To be honest, this was the least of my worries. It wasn't long until I heard another voice whispering at me through the aisle of books. I turned to see who was talking to me, and it was a younger woman who couldn't be older than 30. She had light blue eyes and was covered in dust. "Oh shit! Someone else is here!" I shouted in happiness and excitement. "Not so loud or they will hear us. Look, I have been following you for some time, and not far from here is a settlement where other people are. We are trying to find a way out and survive. Come with me, she spoke in a hushed tone. Who are they? I asked. Just follow me. When we are safe, we can talk. She stood up and slowly started to walk toward the end of the aisle to meet me. We both stood there, and she nodded and gestured for me to follow her. After what seemed like half an hour of walking, we arrived at the makeshift settlement. It was a bunch of bookshelves turned to make a small fortress. It was pressed against the corner of two walls, one with a bathroom and the other looking to be a staff room with a small kitchen. As we entered inside, there was a population of about 20 people here. All of different races and sizes, however, no matter the language, it seems we all could understand it. I got to sit down and speak to the lady who saved me. So what are the things you were talking about earlier? I asked nervously. Well, we call them the librarians. They are large spider-like creatures who have human faces and long black hair. If you are too loud, they can find you easily. However, they seem to be blind, so not making any noise makes it to where they can't find us. Here we are safe to make noise, but we don't know why. She spoke in a relaxed tone. So how do we eat and drink? I'm really hungry and didn't bring any food. My stomach growled as I spoke, which caused a slight bit of pain. Well, the staff kitchen seems to have a near limitless supply of food. No matter what we take from the fridge, it seems to restock itself. So help yourself. It's been weeks and I still haven't found a way out. I walked what seemed to be 100 miles, which led nowhere. Last night, I saw a librarian for the first time. This was when a man named Jerry started to walk with me to find more survivors. We walked a couple of miles away and heard a yelling. Anyone there? Hello? We started to pick up the pace and rounded a corner to find a man yelling and asking for help. He spotted us and he shouted again, "Hey! Over here! Help me!" Before we could tell him to be quiet, it was too late. A librarian pounced on him and tore him into pieces. Chunks of flesh were being tossed. Every bite the librarian took seemed to spray a fine mist of blood into the air, filling the air with the smell of iron. It took everything I could to not vomit, as I could hear the muscle snapping off the bone like a rubber band breaking. The sound of bone crunching and blood squelching was the only thing we heard as we silently walked away. I wish I was home. Something dark in the library. Okay, so I want to start this off by saying something plain and simple. This is not your run-of-the-mill unrealistic horror story, the kind of which is common lately, and which I, admittedly, much prefer to this story. There is no intense gore or huge scares. There is no vicious monster waiting to jump out and rip me to pieces, that I know of. Shit. This is a simple story of creeping dread and that most primal fear of mankind, the unknown. I work in my small northern town's public library and have since high school, though not always in the same position. It's pretty much my dream job. Books, A+, peace, A+, not a lot to do most times, B-. It gets boring, sometimes. But, essentially, it's a good job for a former, maybe, slacker who wants to work but doesn't want to work. The library is where the story takes place, in case you were wondering. It's also completely true, though I don't expect you to take my word for it. Most people say their stories are true. But anyway, let's start with a few more facts if you don't mind. First, the library building used to be an old Catholic school and still stands next to the local Catholic church. As such, the layout can be a bit unusual compared to other libraries. You can still see where the rooms used to be, and it's very segmented. It's essentially a long rectangular space with rooms connected to one long hallway. Small, but nice. Through the front doors is the main hallway. Immediately upon entering, there are two doors to the left, a multi-purpose room and a storage room, and one door to the right, a meeting room. Just beyond that is the front desk on the right, which, from behind, does not have a view of either of the two entrances at the front and back. On the left across from the desk is a computer room, next to which is a children's section that can be seen from the computer room through a wall of windows, and vice versa. The entire rest of the right side of the building is the stacks, the bookshelves, and a small section at the very back with a table and bench for teenagers. The left has bathrooms for men and women, and past that is a lounge area with a fireplace and couches. This all happened around Christmas time, so there were two large Christmas trees in the lounge as well. The biggest thing of relevance to this story is that there is a lot of glass. Windows, display cases, that sort of thing. Reflections upon reflections are all over the place, and at night when you're alone it can be pretty spooky. Now, I want to say that I believe in ghosts or spirits or whatever. I've seen and heard too many things for it all to be false. A lot of my experiences were in the library. My coworker, who has also experienced similar things, insists that it's the ghosts of the old nuns who used to run the Catholic school. It might be, for all I know. But all I can say is I've heard doors open and slam shut when nobody is around, our doors close by themselves and require a handle to be turned to open, so it's not the wind either, and I've found books lying on the floor in the stacks in an empty library when, mere minutes earlier, they were on the shelf. I've also seen movement out of the corner of my eye, heard creaks and groans. It's an old building, so that one's easily explainable, and plenty of other strange phenomena. But the night I was about to document was like nothing I ever experienced or have ever since. It was a Monday in mid-December, during a particularly nasty winter storm, and I was working an evening shift, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The wind howled outside, and the outer doors, which were not held shut, bumped and banged frequently. Looking back, there were a lot of strange things that I didn't immediately notice. First of all, when I came in, there was a mop leaning against the wall next to the front desk. Not unusual, except I realized that it was a day when maintenance never cleaned. They like to slack off early in the week. I don't blame them. There were also two lights out in the kids section, which was unusual as they had to have been on during the day shift or the boss would have called maintenance to change them. That's one thing they're always good at doing quickly. Also weird was that immediately after I unlocked the doors, there was a car parked outside. It was running, its headlights were on, but nobody got out or came inside. It stayed there for 20 minutes before leaving. That was strange, but not off-putting. But even still, from the moment I walked in, I felt a creeping sense of unease in my nerves. Every corner I turned made my heart race, every noise made me jump, even the silence pressed against my chest like a weight. I spent the night clinging to a long wooden rod that was kept in storage for some unknown purpose, just in case I needed to defend myself. The strangeness continued when a woman came in about halfway through the evening. She was a regular, always showing up on Monday nights, checking out some DVDs, and chatting about anything and everything. That night, however, she picked her movies quickly, checked them out, and left in a hurry, looking as though she were nervous or unsettled. This was when I began realizing something was truly wrong, because immediately after she left, the building's boiler kicked in and began roaring throughout the library louder than it had ever done before. It growled like some feral beast, shaking the books on their shelves, and then in less than 5 minutes it stopped and the silence returned. But this time, the silence held something else, some lingering whisper of the angry boiler's roar. I began seeing movement just in my periphery or in a reflection in the many glass surfaces. There was never any detail or shape, just shadows and movement. The only thing I knew, it was slowly but steadily moving closer to me. The wooden rod became a crutch. I clung to it as I returned books to their shelves and ventured into the cluttered storage room to prepare for an upcoming puppet show, even when I could no longer fight my bladder and had to run to the washroom. That stick was in my hands or reach of them at all times. The night was creeping slowly to an end, but the cold dread crawling down my spine didn't let up. This wasn't like the other ghostly encounters. There was never any fear, never any malice in those encounters, and there was rarely any evidence that something was happening until it did. But this, it was dark. It was oppressive. It felt evil, as dramatic as that sounds. Like some dark force had seeped into the walls and was trying to claw its way out. 8 o'clock came, and I locked up the doors and, very reluctantly, shut off the lights. I was shutting everything off in my office when it finally reached a crescendo. I reached for the radio to shut it off and, in the static that always buzzed when my hand got too close, I've got a metal rod in my wrist. It messes with the signal, I guess. I heard a voice. Quiet, raspy, but distinctly human and clearly English. It growled one word that made my blood run cold: run. So I ran. I crashed out the doors, leaving the rod in the office to no doubt be found by my confused coworkers the next day, and I didn't stop running until I was home, even though that cold dread washed away the second I left the building. I didn't get a chance to talk to my coworkers until Thursday afternoon. I was working with one of the girls who had seen a lot of weird stuff, and I decided to mention it to her. The second I started telling her about the growling boiler and the shadows creeping closer, she nodded and got nervous. She told me that the same thing had happened to her the following night, Tuesday, right down to the creepy voice on the radio when she turned it off. So we decided to mention it to our boss, who was the only skeptic among us. We liked to talk about the spooky stuff we saw or heard just to see her reactions, which were usually scoffs and eye rolls, but this time went very differently. We started telling her all about it, and immediately her face went white. She had worked Wednesday night by herself, and she'd felt uneasy all night. She kept seeing things moving in the corner of her eye, and she confessed that as she was leaving she heard a voice whispering somewhere in the library. She got freaked out and called maintenance to make sure nobody was hiding in the building, but they didn't find anything. The whole rest of the shift we began feeling that same creeping sense of dread, and by the end of the shift we all agreed that nobody would be working nights alone for a long while. We still get scared shitless most nights, but at least we're not alone. I work in a creepy library. I work in a university library that has about 5 floors, so it is pretty large. My job is to shelve books, so I work alone. Due to COVID-19, my library is only doing curbside pickup, so it only has a few people in it, which makes it very eerie. Here's one of my creepy intrusive thoughts while working. I was working on a regularly quiet floor, even quieter with the place shut down. I did not have my music in because I was working with some difficult books to shelve. The stillness was a bit weird but peaceful. Working in a library, I got pretty good about listening for footsteps so I would not get the heck scared out of me when someone walked by. On this particular day, I heard a brisk pair of footsteps coming closer to me. I figured it was my supervisor coming to check in or update me about something, so when the footsteps got close, I looked up from what I was doing to greet her. However, when I looked up, no one was there and the footsteps had stopped. Okay, I thought. I figured it was someone else who was walking faster than I had realized. Come to think of it, my supervisor usually walks a bit quieter, so I do not know why I would assume it was her. I go back to work for a while when I hear those fast-paced footsteps again. The lights in the library are motion censored and they also came on a couple of aisles down. This time I stopped and waited to see who it was because I was curious, and I knew most people who worked in the building, so I thought I would wave. However, before the footsteps reached me, they stopped abruptly. Some time passed and eventually, the censored lights went off again. Okay, I thought. I was a bit creeped out now. I looked through the shelves to see if I could see anyone in the other aisles. No one was there. I crept slowly out to the middle aisle and no one was there. I got chills as I realized that there was nowhere for this person to have gone unless they had passed me on the way. I got the courage to go back to work and just tried to not think about it. At one point, I was sitting on the floor, putting books away on the bottom shelf. I was going about my business when I felt the strongest feeling of uncomfortableness. I just felt eyes on me. I quickly looked up, wanting desperately to know who, or what, was staring. I looked to my left, nothing. I looked to my right, nothing. Then, I looked ahead through the shelf. And there was a lady. Staring. Right. At me. She was a few aisles down, looking through the shelf across from me. She was an older woman, dressed plainly, with a tight bun pulling her hair back tightly. She had a dead stare on her face. It was like she did not notice me, or anything around her for that matter. I jumped and gasped. Then I kind of giggled at myself and grabbed my chest where my heart was located. This was nothing to be afraid of, it was just a lady that worked here as well. She was possibly looking for a book that was requested. I waved at her and said, "Oh my, you scared me." She did not reply. Her face did not react or change in any way. And she never broke her gaze on me. Figuring she was not the joking type, I just awkwardly went back to work. I went about my shelving when a feeling of dread started to come over me. Something just was not right about what happened and I could not shake it. Then, it hit me. When I saw the lady looking at me, I was sitting on the floor. That means that she was crouched down in the same spot across from me, just staring right at me. I started to realize just how weird that was, and then a second realization hit me. I had never seen that lady in my life. To be fair, it was a larger library, but only a few people were working in the building and I would have at least seen her face before. As all of this was hitting me, I froze while I was putting a book on the shelf. I was staring at my feet, mouth slightly open in shock and confusion. When suddenly I felt that uncomfortableness return. I started to come back to earth, and as I did, that uncomfortable feeling just grew stronger. There were eyes on me at that moment, and I had a feeling about whose eyes. I knew I had to look up, I could not hold back. I slowly raised my gaze to the shelf at eye level. My heart thudded loudly during every slow and agonizing second it took to raise my head. I was soon looking straight ahead through the shelf, and that is where I met the eyes of the blank stare, belonging to that old woman. Except this time, she was not a few aisles away. No, this time she was in the aisle directly next to me. Less than 2 feet away, with only a bookshelf between, was that unknown old woman and her dead stare that filled me with dread. TLDR, an intrusive thought I had while working about hearing disembodied footsteps and then seeing old women stare right at me through the bookshelf. Alone in the library. I used to like being alone in the library. Every weekday, the library across from Elephant and Castle Underground Station closed at 10 p.m. Its fluorescent lights flickered off, students begrudgingly shut down the bulky computers, and a cleaning crew picked up any abandoned coffee cups or sandwich wrappers. The library is now closed, a tired voice droned over the intercom. Printers will be shut off. Nobody was around to hear the announcement. Nobody, that is, except me. I sat slumped over my thesis in a hidden corner of the library, my computer screen black after being idle for too long. After a long period of writing some meaningless words down, scratching them out, and then rewriting, I must have dozed off. After what felt like a matter of minutes, my eyes snapped open and I had the distinct feeling someone was watching me. Everything was completely dark now, save the dull glow of the green emergency exit lights. The cleaning crew must have overlooked me and left. A strange sense of calmness overcame me as I realized I was completely and utterly alone. No obnoxious side conversations, no drones of keyboards typing, just a distant buzz of night buses zipping by on the street outside. I moved the computer mouse around until the screen illuminated my desk space, still littered with miscellaneous papers and journal scribblings. 11:45, the clock told me at the top of the screen. I was sleeping for longer than I thought. In an almost trance-like state, my phone's flashlight guided me through the shelves and corridors. I liked it here when everything went quiet. There was a comfortability in knowing the books and magazines and encyclopedias all remained the same, even if nobody was around to flip through their pages. The smell was the first thing that tipped me off that something was out of place. A distinct smell of cigarettes and urine? No, maybe body odor. For a place usually emanating an aroma of coffee beans and old paper, the pungent scent of rot was unusual. I began walking, slowly at first, then jogging, away from the weird smell. I had a hunch I needed to get out of this library now. I stumbled through the maze of shelves, but stopped dead in my tracks when something caught my eye. Somebody was watching me from the other side of the bookshelf. A pair of glistening eyes met mine as I instinctually removed a book from the shelf to reveal more of the dark figure. As I did, the putrid smell reached my nose from across the aisle. I tried not to gag as I choked out the words, "Who are you?" to the perfectly still person. No response. That's when I started running for my life. I didn't check to see if I was being followed. Forgetting about my laptop and coat, I bolted out of the library's emergency exit doors, down a dark stairwell, and out onto the shockingly frigid streets of London. I ran, not caring who was watching until the old library was enveloped by other buildings. In a daze, I called the police and clumsily explained that I thought I'd just found somebody in the library who wasn't supposed to be there. Yes, I was out of the building. No, I didn't get a good look at them. No, I'm not sure where I am right now. By the Imperial War Museum, I think. Yes, I'll wait here. I waited for what felt like an eternity. 10 minutes passed, and an officer briskly approached me and instructed me to walk back with him to the building, which was now being searched by the Uni security guards. He told me the guards would retrieve my things for me, and then he'd ask me some questions about what I thought I saw. We were rounding the corner to the library when a police car, sirens blaring, sped past us and screeched to a halt in front of the building. 2 officers ran in, reaching for their weapons. The officer with me received a muffled message from his radio, something about a code 2 and a code 43 and backup being on the way shortly. I studied the officer's face as the color drained from it. He gruffly explained that we needed to wait here and vaguely said that I'm lucky I got out of that library when I did. The police would later inform me that they were on the hunt for a notorious serial killer a year ago, but the case went cold. The man they were looking for was hiding out in the ceiling of a local library, it turns out, and only came down after closing time to raid the office pantry. He'd slink down from an air vent, made possible by months of near starvation, and frantically scavenge for scraps of leftover food. He was driven to madness after living in nocturnal solitude for months. I don't like being alone in the library anymore. I discovered a vampire in the library basement. I've always been an avid reader, the kind who would spend hours in the library lost in the world of books. My local library, a centuries-old building, was my sanctuary. It was a place where I felt at peace, surrounded by the scent of old books and the soft hum of the air conditioning. But that all changed one fateful evening. I was in the library, as usual, engrossed in a novel about ancient civilizations. As the evening wore on, I realized I was the last patron left. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, informed me that they were closing soon, but I could stay a bit longer if I wanted. Gratefully, I nodded and continued reading. After a while, I needed to stretch my legs and decided to explore the basement. I'd heard rumors about it being haunted, but I never believed in such things. The basement was off limits to the public, but my curiosity got the better of me. I sneaked down the old wooden staircase, the creaking of the steps echoing in the silence. The basement was dimly lit, with rows of old manuscripts and books covered in dust. As I walked further in, I stumbled upon a locked door with an ornate handle. The door seemed out of place, newer than the rest of the basement. My curiosity piqued. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned. Inside was a small room, the walls lined with old portraits and a large ornate mirror in the center. But what caught my attention was a figure in the corner, a man with pale skin and sharp features, dressed in clothes from a bygone era. His eyes, a deep shade of red, locked onto mine. Frozen in fear, I watched as he slowly approached me. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. He smiled, revealing a set of sharp fangs. "I am Lord Alistair, and you, my dear, have awakened me from my slumber." I backed away, realizing the gravity of my mistake. "You're a vampire?" He nodded. "Indeed. I've been trapped in this library for centuries, waiting for someone to release me." Panicking, I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed my wrist, his grip cold and unyielding. "You've set me free," he whispered, "and for that, I am grateful. But I am also very hungry." I closed my eyes, preparing for the worst. But then, a bright light filled the room. Mrs. Henderson stood at the doorway, holding a cross. "Back, a creature of the night," she shouted. Lord Alistair hissed and released me, retreating to the shadows. Mrs. Henderson quickly pulled me out of the room and locked the door behind us. As we made our way upstairs, she explained that the library was built on the grounds of Lord Alistair's mansion. He had been a feared vampire lord in the 18th century before being trapped in the library basement by a group of hunters. The library staff had been guarding the secret ever since. I thanked Mrs. Henderson for saving me and promised never to venture into the basement again. But the events of that night haunted me. Every time I passed by the library, I could feel Lord Alistair's eyes on me, waiting for another chance to be set free. And then, one day, I noticed Mrs. Henderson was no longer at the library. The new librarian told me she had retired and moved away. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. A few weeks later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a note in elegant handwriting. "Thank you for setting me free. I have taken care of Mrs. Henderson. You're next." From that day on, I lived in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for Lord Alistair to come for me. The consequence of my curiosity was a life of paranoia and dread, knowing that a centuries-old vampire was out there, hunting me. Night at the library. I have been at my job now for about a year and a half. I am a customer service specialist at the library in my town. The building itself is very, very old, even though the inside was renovated a few years before I started. I should put it out there that I do not believe in the spirits of people who have passed lingering to mess with us. I do, however, believe is demons that want to scare and mess with you. All that being said, here is my story. When I first started, they would have me close with someone at either the front desk or in our children's section to learn the basics of the job when it was not too busy. One night, after everyone left but me and the girl training me, I heard the door next to the desk I was at open. I turned to greet the person as I was supposed to, but when I looked, there was no one there and the door was slowly closing. The doors are the kind that have some weight to them, so they always close after you walk through and were not able to be yanked open by any small breeze that made its way into the entryway from the outer door being opened. Also, the center of the door is all glass, so I would have seen someone if they went back up the stairs, and because the entryway echoes so much because of the vaulted ceilings, I should have heard their steps no matter how soft. Since I had just started, I just kind of brushed it off as weird and maybe the nervousness of being left by myself for a minute. About a week after that, I felt comfortable enough to start closing the front desk completely on my own. While I was finishing up the money drawer, the two other people I was closing with said they were going to head downstairs to grab their things and wait to clock out. When I was done, I headed down the staff stairway and looked down to answer a text from my boyfriend. When I got to the landing of the first set of steps, I heard someone coming back up the steps. I just figured they left something at their desk and were headed back up to grab it. I laughed and said something along the lines of, "Wow, excited to get back to work already?" I got no response though. When I got to the bottom of the steps, I was super creeped out that I didn't pass anyone, and the doors are again ones that close themselves, and you can hear the echo of a very loud click in the stairwell. I got to the staff lounge and saw no one was missing from our closing group. I didn't say anything about it because I didn't feel like branding myself the crazy new girl quite yet. And my last story. I was again closing the front desk and everyone had already gone downstairs to get their things to leave. I was still kinda slow at closing stuff since it was only my 4th week. Now before I get into it, I need to explain a little now the front area is set up. You can only get behind the front desk if you go around to the little hallway and come in the door. Right through the door, there is a small workspace, and then through a wide opening is the front desk area. When I just finished locking the cash drawer, I heard the door to the workspace open. I looked around the little bit of wall the desk was connected to so I could see who was coming in. When I looked, the door was standing open. Now, as I have said before, the doors are so heavy they slowly close themselves and finish with an echoing click. I just sat there staring at the door for a minute waiting for something. I then managed a weak little hello, and right when I said that, the door slammed closed with such force the glass was rattling. I said heck with the door, hopped the front desk, and took off down the stairs that lead up to the front desk. When I made it down to the staff area, I was panting and out of breath from terror, and everyone just stared at me for a minute. Then the closing librarian asked what happened, and I told them. They just kinda started laughing and said, "Oh, so you finally met the library ghost. She likes to mess with the new people." In addition to these specific times, I see things out of the corner of my eye all the time. It only happens when there are no customers, though. There can be other staff members when I see it, but never customers. The library's lurking legacy. In the heart of the city, the old Evergreen Library had always been a sanctuary for Eleanor. Every evening after work, she'd curl up in her favorite corner, losing herself in tales of old. One evening, as rain lightly tapped on the library's stained glass windows, Eleanor came across a peculiar leather-bound book. No title, no author, just a quill inked on its cover. Curiosity piqued, she opened it, and a single line greeted her. To see them, turn to page 13. Puzzled, Eleanor flipped to page 13. It was an illustration of the library's reading room, the very room she was in. And there, in her favorite corner, was a meticulously detailed drawing of her, reading. The details were uncanny: her dress, the way her hair was pinned, even the necklace her grandmother had given her. Heart-pounding, Eleanor turned the page, only to find another illustration, this one of the library's entrance. But what unnerved her was the depiction of shadowy figures lurking just outside, their eyes fixated on the inside. She continued flipping, each page showing the figures moving closer, their features becoming clearer. With each page, Eleanor's heart raced faster, and she had an overwhelming feeling of being watched. She closed the book, trying to shake off the unease. But a whispering voice behind her said, "Continue, Eleanor." Startled, she spun around. There was no one, but she could feel a cold breeze, despite being indoors. Hesitantly, Eleanor opened the book again. The figures were now inside the library, their ghostly faces contorted with malevolent grins. And they were getting closer to her depicted self. Eleanor's hands trembled. She was about to shut the book when she noticed the next page was different, a mirror. In its reflection, the dark figures stood behind her, their cold hands reaching out. Frantically, she slammed the book shut and sprinted to the exit. The massive wooden doors wouldn't budge. The lights began to flicker, and shadows danced on the walls. The whispering voice returned, echoing around her, "You shouldn't have opened the book, Eleanor." In desperation, she remembered the first line she had read. Maybe there was a way out. She opened the book to the first page and scribbled, "Eleanor escapes." As the ink dried, the library's atmosphere shifted. The whispering ceased, and the doors creaked open. Eleanor rushed out into the rain-soaked night, leaving the eerie book behind. Weeks passed, and Eleanor avoided the library. But one evening, curiosity overcame her fear. She returned to her favorite corner, and to her relief, the mysterious book was gone. As she settled into a new novel, a young man entered, taking a seat nearby. Eleanor caught a glimpse of what he was reading, a leather-bound book with a quill on its cover. She watched in horror as he turned to page 13, and her heart dropped when she saw the new illustration, the man reading in the library, with Eleanor's shadowy figure lurking behind him.